A very good afternoon to the panel and, of course, the audience in its entirety. I am Siyavuya Ntlale. I'm a master's candidate from the University of Cape Town. And today I'm representing the Department of Information Systems. And so today I will be presenting my paper, which was co-authored by my very brilliant supervisor, Professor Iwan Brown, who has really just been my guiding light throughout this whole journey. And as displayed on the screen, the title of my paper is Factors Influencing Sensitive Data Protection Practices in South African Public Schools. Now, before I can formally and academically present this paper, I'd like to just share a brief background story on what actually sparked my interest in this topic. So recently, South Africa has unfortunately become known for cases of funeral policy fraud, where the syndicates would exploit vulnerable people's sensitive data just so they can collect large sums of insurance payouts. They would even resort to orchestrating unnatural deaths. And this is also a case in Cradock, a small town where I come from. There have been similar incidents. So in essence, all these incidents, they highlight the risk that is associated with sensitive data falling into the wrong hands. Because in order to carry out these schemes, the perpetrators would need personal information such as their names, ID numbers, birth dates, and so forth, which all is considered as highly sensitive data. So upon reflecting on these events, I then began to think critically about the school environment, which also stores similar sensitive data about the learners, their families, and of course the teachers. So ultimately, this then led me to explore sensitive data protection practices within the school environment. Now, with that being said, I think it would be the right time to get into the research itself. Starting off with the abstract, which I will not spend much time on because it was provided on the program. And then the next slide shows the table of contents, which is basically the overview of how the presentation will be structured. Right, now to dive into the contextual background of this research paper. As we may know, we live in a digital era which has resulted in the integration of technological tools to carry out business processes. Now, this not only happens in the corporate world, but it also has become prevalent within the educational institution. Goran, in his 2016 paper, adds that this surge in the use of digital tools can be traced back to the white paper notice of 1869 on e-education, which touches on the transformation of teaching and learning through ICT. And of course, the most recent COVID-19 pandemic, which also expedited the adoption of technological tools within the education space. So both these factors, they do lead to an extensive use of digital tools in areas such as administration, pedagogy, and social life. So in terms of administration, the Department of Basic Education does provide a software called SASAMS, which assists the schools with their school administration and reporting. And then in terms of pedagogy, teachers that were interviewed, they did declare that they used software such as Google Classroom and Kahoot in order to enhance their teaching and learning. And of course, there's the social media side of things. I think nowadays, it's very rare to find a school that does not have a Facebook page or an Instagram page. Some even have YouTube pages. Now, all these software applications, they have one thing in common: sensitive data. According to the POPI Act, the definition of sensitive data is as stated on the slide. And in the context of schools, that would include disciplinary records, health records, metadata, date of birth, ID number, and so forth, as displayed. So essentially, there's always some sort of software or digital tool that is used in the school to make life simpler. And in as much as the intention is to make life simpler, they do also present challenges. And the most important one is the fact that these digital tools, they gather, they store, and they analyze massive quantities of sensitive data of the various groups, which are the learners, and keeping in mind that these learners are minors, so their information would be accompanied by their parents, and then the teachers, of course. This then brings us to the research problem. So what exactly is the issue here? What are we trying to solve? Where is the research gap? As we have already figured out, the adoption of digital tools, it results in huge volumes of sensitive data being collected, stored, and transmitted, which in tandem, it opens up new doors for cyber attacks, for data breaches. Now, imagine the Rosemary Ndlovus of this world gaining access to all the sensitive data. Even unauthorized third parties also gain access to this sensitive data, and the potential harm that this would cause is unimaginable. Having said that, the gap now lies in the fact that schools, they tend to forget that they are in fact responsible for protecting these three different groups' sensitive data. So, the research problem is that schools prioritize the benefits of ICT education while they disregard the challenges that come with it. That being the importance of safeguarding sensitive data, which is generated through the ICT tools. And then taking into consideration the study gap, we have the research question and the aligning objective. The research question, as you can see, is what are the factors that influence sensitive data protection practices in South African public schools? And then the objective is then to identify these key factors. And then the next step, before the next step, we look at the justification and the potential benefits. Why exactly is it important to carry out this research? Because practices, these sensitive data protection practices are crucial. And they are crucial because there are a vast amount of sensitive data that is managed and retained within the school environment. We also rely on third-party providers, which is through pedagogy, administration, and social interactions. Potential benefits would be adequate practices in school, improved data protection, identifying vulnerabilities, increased compliance, also knowing how to comply with the POPI Act within the school environment, filling in the gaps in literature, and more focus on underdeveloped economies. And of course, most importantly, to enhance the trust from the parent side so that they know that their sensitive data or their child's sensitive data is in fact protected in the school environment. Now, the next step is to see what other researchers have discovered in this area of interest. And we're going to do that by exploring the literature review. So I have divided this section into various subsections, which is the selection and selection procedure, the themes that were discovered, the conceptual framework, and of course, summarize everything. In terms of the procedure, there were restrictions and there were also inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the search engines that were used were the UCT Library and Google Scholar, and out of that, we only looked at books, journals, and conference papers. The keywords are as stated on the slide. Time period was 2013 up until 2023. The restrictions, we used databases such as Scopus, Web of Science, Springer, and then if the paper was peer-reviewed, it would be included. And if the context was South Africa, it would also be included. But if it lacked a clear focus on the information systems or data security, it would be excluded. And if the abstract was irrelevant, it would also be excluded. Now, with the landscape of data security and protection, there are various themes that impact the practices of sensitive data protection within the South African public school, which are attitudes towards data protection, technological resources, organizational culture, awareness, training, and compliance with the POPI Act. Now, in terms of attitude towards data protection, this refers to how people actually perceive sensitive data protection. For instance, in the context of school, if educators and administration clerks perceive data protection as low priority, then the development and implementation of cyber safety policies was not prioritized. But if they did see it as high priorities, they would prevent breaches. Also, if they believe that the likelihood of the risk of data breaches is low, they may not take sufficient actions to prevent or minimize the consequences of these breaches. And then technological resources. Resources such as budgeting and staffing, they work hand in hand with technological resources, which are used for sensitive data protection. For instance, encryption and secure storage. One cannot exist without the other. So public schools with limited budgets and qualified staff, they may not be able to afford or maintain the latest security technologies. And then we move on to the organizational culture. According to Kritzinger, schools with strong culture of privacy and data protection, they are more inclined to prioritize and implement effective measures to protect sensitive data. And in contrast, the schools with a complacent culture, they may have a more relaxed approach. Moving on to the awareness of sensitive data protection practices. In the event that individuals at schools are aware of the importance of protecting sensitive data and they understand the potential risk of mishandling or exposing sensitive data, then they're more likely to take appropriate precautionary measures. These precautionary measures could be secure login credentials, strong passwords, refraining from sharing, and incident reporting. With training and awareness, they are interrelated factors. So more training via these training sessions, workshops, and frequent reminders, they would lead to greater awareness and emphasize the significance of sensitive data protection. And then there's compliance with data protection regulations such as the POPI Act. So similar to other organizations, schools, they also need to comply with the Act. And Kritzinger notes that there is still a notable lack of supporting cyber safety policies, practices, and protocols within South African schools. And then we have our conceptual framework, which shows the connection between these factors. First and foremost, technological resources are directly linked to the compliance of regulations. Therefore, with adequate resources such as budget and infrastructures, schools can easily implement the necessary compliance procedures. And then secondly, positive attitudes would lead to the compliance of POPI Act. Therefore, there is a direct link between attitudes and regulation compliance. And then lastly, awareness and training efforts, they impact the organizational culture by fostering a data protection conscious atmosphere. And then that would promote a positive attitude. And then in summary, a great deal of the literature comes from the listed researchers. And then from that, I can synthesize the following gaps. Gap number one would be that literature on drawbacks of ICT adoption, they fail to address the issue of sensitive data vulnerability. And more often than not, literature on sensitive data protection is in the context of private organization instead of the school environment. And then also, the focus is more often than not on the learner's responsibility to protect themselves within the cyberspace. Instead of focusing on how the teachers or the clerks, the administration clerks, protect sensitive data within the school environment. Next up, we'll look at the research methodology. Because of time constraint, I'm not going to spend much time on it. However, if there's still time remaining at the end, I'm happy to come back to this section. The ontology that was used was constructivism, epistemology was interpretivism, The approach to the theory was inductive, the research purpose was explanatory, and the time frame was cross-sectional because the data was collected at a single point in time. And then also the ethical considerations, also not spending that much time on it because of time constraint. Ethical clearance from the UCT and from the Department of Education before even engaging with the participants, informed consent for participants, the confidentiality and anonymity, rigorous data security methods, and also respect for autonomy. Then we look at the methodology that was used to collect the data. The research strategy was qualitative. Instruments that were used, semi-structured interviews, transcribed interviews, observed notes. Sampling was purposive. The target population was the administration clerks, educators and their HODs, school social media managers, which also happened to be the learners, and then the Department of Education finance clerks. The response rate was 10 out of the 15. And then the data analysis was thematic, and the tool that was used was NVivo. And then we look at the findings and the discussion. So what are the findings saying compared to the existing literature? So in terms of understanding the sensitive data, findings revealed that participants across diverse roles and experience level, they typically have an understanding of what sensitive data is, except for the social media manager who also happened to be the learner, because they did respond with, they just take pictures and upload on Facebook. And this implies that schools have been successfully fostering awareness of what sensitive data is and what its importance is amongst the staff, however, not so much on the learners. And then in terms of technological resources, overall findings on the technological resources, they suggest that all the participants have access to technological resources that contribute to sensitive data protection practices. For instance, through specialized software such as SASAMS and access controls via password-protected systems with expiring passwords. One of the clerks even mentioned that their passwords do expire after a certain time. Moving on to attitudes and culture. Now, there seems to be a noticeable pattern between organizational culture and the teacher's attitude towards sensitive data, because one of the interviewed clerks did express that teachers are very curious. They would even want to have access to the systems. So ultimately, in schools where the culture encourages curiosity or resistance to sensitive data protection, teachers and staff, they tend to have a negative attitude towards practicing sensitive data. And then awareness and training. In general, most participants are aware of the importance of sensitive data protection practices, regardless of their experience or role. As participant one commented, they said that there's loads of sensitive data in the school. However, there may be a lack of awareness within the non-administrative participants, which is the social media manager, which clearly shows that they are unaware that images do in fact contain sensitive metadata, such as user information, geolocation, timestamp, and so forth. And then we move on to training. In terms of training, there seems to be mixed reviews. Some clerks did state that they have not received any formal training. They practically learn on the job, and the previous clerks would then teach them how to use the software. But in other schools, some clerks did proclaim that they do in fact have regular workshops to learn new functions about the system. And then in terms of the compliance with the POPI Act, the schools have varied levels of compliance with sensitive data protection regulations, such as the POPI Act. There also seems to be a noticeable pattern there between compliance and experienced data breaches. Schools that do not comply with POPI Act, they don't see the need to comply because they've never experienced data breaches. This then brings me to my conclusion, which the results highlight the importance of technological resources in ensuring that protection of sensitive data within school is a factor. And also the key challenges would be the variability in training, inconsistency in compliance, the resistance amongst the staff, which underscores the need for targeted interventions to strengthen data protection practices. And then in terms of the recommendations for future research, a comparative analysis between South African public schools and private schools in order to provide a comprehensive review of the sensitive data practices. And the other recommendation, which I am currently working on, is organizational efficacy in protecting the public sensitive data, and the empirical setting is the public sector as a whole. That would be the references for this paper, and thank you so much for your time and attention. That is the end of it. I'm happy to take any questions or recommendations.
Yeah, so we have time for a question, but can I maybe ask that in the interest of time, Dirk maybe comes and set up his slide in the meantime so that I can introduce it. Let's see who's got a question. There's definitely people working in schools environments, so maybe they've got a question. But they don't look at me, they deliberately avoid my stare. There she stares back. Anybody with a question, Mariana?
Just a question on your search terms. I see that you didn't include schools in the search terms. I was just wondering, how did you relate your findings to the schools? So if you can just elaborate on that very briefly.
Can I access my slides? Is it possible? Oh, okay. Thank you for the question. I do see what you are referring to. It must have been a mistake because public schools was definitely part of the search keywords. Because without that, then I would not have a whole research paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.